Hi again, this is Sarah from the State Library, and I'm going to today be talking about microhistories, a form of narrative nonfiction that I really enjoy. On Tuesday, we got to listen to Aaron in Albany County talk about nonfiction for foodies, and I think I would say narrative nonfiction has been around for a good long while. Truman Capote is credited with the first nonfiction novel with In Cold Blood. I do think it's been around for a good long while, but I feel like in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been some really great literature out there that read like novels. Certainly memoirs are a real popular genre, and then of course there's always the subsequent controversy that centers around memoirs of over if they're true or not. But one that I kind of stumbled onto sort of unsuspectingly is a type called the microhistory, and it is searching for answers to large questions in small places. I'm just going to take a little bit of time here to talk about a few authors and titles that I've enjoyed, and then I invite you to share any others that you might know about, and we'll talk about specifically what this type of nonfiction is. So the first, my slides aren't changing. Give me one moment. There we go. The first microhistory that I read, without having a name to what it was Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky. And this book has been around for a while, and some of you out there might be familiar with it. And I just want to share my story of how I came to even learn about microhistories after picking up this book. I completely picked up this book because I like potato chips. So there's my silly confession to the group. I wonder what this could possibly be about, but I love salty foods, so let's check it out. And I remember enjoying the book. It's pretty long, which can be intimidating for me personally as a reader. And there are admittedly some parts for me that are kind of dry, but it was readable to me because each chapter was sort of its own little essay on salt. It talked about salt mining and salt in foods and the various parts of the world where salt plays an important part in its economy and politics and the politics of food, going back to some of those things that Aaron talked about the other day. Some of the things on salt mining to me were interesting, but got kind of technical, so that was the area that was a little dry to me. So that was something I really kind of enjoyed. And after I read it, I started noticing some other titles that were, where the title was one, just a thing, and then something like A World History or That Changed the World, and that's why I had named my presentation How Microhistories Changed the World, kind of tongue-in-cheek, because I came to find that a lot of these books, were one small thing that, an everyday item that you never think of, and then the subtitle was inevitably How It Changed the World. So very dramatic statement. It kind of makes me think of Donald Trump on the Apprentice. Everything's the best. It's the greatest thing ever. And so obviously the writers of many of these books are quite passionate about their singular topic. So throughout the years, I had read Salt, I had picked up a few other books, and then it wasn't, I think, until a reader's advisory course or workshop or something that I learned the term microhistory, and I thought, what a great little way to encapsulate these types of books I had already been reading. And then I actually, not too long ago, learned that microhistory is in itself an actual academic subdiscipline in the discipline of history and the humanities. So I kind of learned about it sort of backwards, I'd say. So I just want to, like I said, I'm just going to share a few titles and authors that I enjoy and how, in fact, these are microhistories and what their stories can kind of says about our cultural history and our natural history. So I already talked about Salt there. Another one, and Mark Kurlansky shows up a few times. He's a historian and a journalist, and quite a few of his books are microhistories. Another one that I think came before Salt was Cod, and with the subtitle "The Fish That Changed the World," and the politically charged history of the seafood industry, again, kind of talking about some of those food narratives that Aaron was talking about the other day. I want to just quickly show, there's so many great authors here, but I'm just going to quickly show Mark Kurlansky's website, because he has, and again, I'm sure there's other authors that do, but he's just the one I'm familiar with. In addition to all of his books that he's written, many of which are these micro-histories, he's also taken a lot of his subject matter and made them into children's books, which I think is wonderful. So he's got the story of salt in a children's book story, and then he also has the cod's tail. So he's taken a lot of the subject matter that he's studied extensively and written for, adult nonfiction, and worked with great illustrators and made them into children's books. I think that's pretty great. And one comment I do want to make on children's books in general is just sort of an aside. When thinking about, this is more of a reference comment than a reader's advisory comment, but I've often, in reference transactions, worked with folks who you can tell, through the conversation, you can tell they just want a little bit of information. They're not doing any major research paper. They don't need to know every detail. And I've often led folks who are just looking for a little bit of information on a piece of history or geography or science, whatever it might be. And I've referred them to some of those upper grade children's books, again in the nonfiction section, because they've been researched. It's not like they're just fluff, and they have just a little bit of information on the Revolutionary War, on the human body, whatever it might be. So just a reference suggestion that I thought I would throw out there, I thought of as I was putting some of this together. Another author that shows up a lot that I've read a few of, and I'm going to slaughter his name, I've never known how to say it, Wiltold Rabinsky. I'm going to go with that. That's how I've always said it in my head. He wrote a book, this one is from quite some time ago, I forget the year, Home, A Short History of an Idea. And that's where, for me, I like this idea of microhistories, because it's the story of an idea, a thing, a place, an event, just one singular moment or thing, and how it becomes a metaphor for our human story, or again, it could be a natural history story as well. And so Home is the story of domestic life and how that came to be throughout the course of human history. And I think he's got an architecture background, so he has a lot of other books on specific buildings or the history of architecture, but he has a few of these they're usually pretty short books that work as microhistories. He also has this one I thought was kind of fun called One Good Turn, and it's the story of the screwdriver and the screw. And I think what grabbed me, I'll admit it, I'm a judge a book by its cover kind of girl. I know you're not supposed to, it's a cardinal rule, but what grabbed me about a lot of these books, I was at a time where I wasn't very interested in fiction, and the titles really grabbed me. I mean, they you start to see that changed the world. It becomes a little silly and cliche after a point, but just the title of it can really grab you, and to think, how did the screwdriver change the world? But think about it, if it changed the way we work in construction and build homes and build cities, these little things that we never think about have a larger impact in our world. Again, with that said, I have read several that are very dry, not as snazzy as the title would make you believe. So, you certainly do want to take caution with judging a book by its cover as well. Simon Winchester has a lot of great history books, and I would put a lot of some of his are biographies. I would put a lot of his in the area of microhistory too. Map That Changed the World is the story of William Smith and the attempt to have lose my vocabulary here, a geographically accurate map of the world. But even with Simon Winchester, some of his biographies too, I would say, it's definitely starting to stretch the idea of the microhistory, but depending on who a biography or a memoir is about, I would say it does serve as sort of this little microcosm view of the world or view of an event, particularly when you're talking about a common person or a less famous character in human history. Rats by and his thing is blurry, and it's Sullivan. Robert Sullivan, I think, is the first name. I apologize. Is definitely not for everyone, because it can make you a little squeamish. It certainly made me squeamish, but it is actually the author toured around with the rats of New York City and like night vision goggles so that he wouldn't interrupt rats' activity. And he goes into a lot of graphic detail about what we consider to be these pretty filthy creatures. And he's focusing specifically on New York City. And what ends up happening is he's telling a history of New York City by the habitat patterns of rats, where they live, what they eat. Certain rats on certain ends of the city have a taste for Chinese food, like in Chinatown, and he ends up delving into some of the human history of New York City and how New York City built up and how it affected these creatures. So, but there's definitely some squeamish points in that book. I've had actually a few coworkers recommend Mary Roach to me, and I haven't personally read her. A friend of mine and an old coworker loves this book. She had a very scientific mind and reads a lot of science books. And this book is The Curious Life of Human Cadavers, and it covers all the stories from people who donate their bodies to science and what happens there, to what happens to cadavers in the in a mortuary, to those folks who are go nameless when they die. So kind of a bunch of different anecdotes of what happens to bodies after we pass on. And a current coworker actually recommended another book of Mary's to me. And I'm going to forget the title now, but it's about the it's called Bonk. And it's the story of sex and coupling, and how the idea of monogamy has taken shape, and then some other like clinical and biological aspects of sex, and how that affects our social interactions in this society. Aaron the other day talked quite a bit about Michael Pollan as someone who has a lot of narrative books about food, the politics of food, with Omnivore's Dilemma, and a few other books of his. The Botany of Desire, to me, is actually 4 micro-histories in one, and he tells a few different human history stories through the eyes of 4 different plants: the apple, the potato, the tulip, and the obviously very politically charged marijuana. And so through those 4 plants and their history of genetic manipulation and agriculture, he tells a story of human society in different parts of the world, and how they've been affected by the plant and how the plant has been affected by us. So those are just a few that I've enjoyed, a few that I have not read but have gotten reviews of from friends. So those first ones I talked about really, I think, definitely define the microhistory, taking this one thing, a thing that tangible object, and talking about learning about it, and through that learning more about ourselves on a global scale. But there are some books, I think, which would maybe be defined as sort of general history, that I think can bring us down to talking about, again, narrowing in on one thing, and that's talking about one specific year. There's a lot of books where the title is a year, and there's a lot of significant years, particularly in American history, and then going beyond in world history. There are a lot of books about 1968. Again, this one is by Mark Kurlansky. There's actually more than one book titled 1968. Obviously a significant year in American history with the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the rise of the counterculture movement, various events that were happening in that particular year in the Vietnam conflict. So that's one, and that's one of those years that in American history class just stands out, I think, to Americans. But there are other what I like about these yearbooks are that sometimes there's those years that you just never learned about in history class, and it either appears that there were significant events that we just never knew about, or it's just this snapshot of how life was during that period of time, and that, again, we maybe never learned about or maybe never considered. I threw this one on Prohibition in there. There are a lot of books that talk about the medieval history, and it covers, several hundred years. And in the span of human existence, several hundred years isn't that long. But again, I would still keep the idea of a microhistory to a limited period of time. So the Prohibition, just those saying the 13 years that changed America, just that short little blip on the radar and how it affected the way we live. The other two that I've enjoyed are is 1421, and it is it's researched, but it's the gentleman who wrote it has evidence and then some speculation of the fact that the populations from Asia actually came further west than we previously discovered. And I think what's significant about this 1421 is there's a lot of books out there titled 1492 when Columbus discovered America. So this, bringing new information to us to consider that what the history we've learned may not be the truth. And one that I also really enjoyed was Scratch of a Pen, 1763. It's actually part of a larger series called Pivotal Moments in American History. This one can get a little dry also, but what struck me about it, again, there's a very popular book called 1776, and here this is a year not too long before the Revolutionary War, and what is significant about it. And it was the end of the French and Indian War, but it also covers a young George Washington before, when he's just another army guy like the rest of them. It talks about the fur trappers out west. It covers all these different snapshots of life, and the Scratch of a Pen alludes to all these rules and laws that were occurring across the ocean from the king, and the fact that due to the way communication worked, people living out west, when I say out west, really you're talking about Ohio at that point, how did they know what laws had gone into effect? And one of the laws that had gone into effect was everything west of the Mississippi was being split up by Britain and Spain, and but who living there knew that, whether it was the Native Americans or the few, the few Europeans that were moving out this way? How were they possibly to know that? And that's not to say that all of a sudden things changed in 1764, but it's just a nice way to take these 365 days, a snapshot of what life was like and what was happening in our history. Another form of microhistory is, to me, it kind of expands on the idea because it goes beyond a moment in time or a thing and takes it and how we can learn from it. And so there are these histories, and these particularly happen in the sciences, I find, where they take a particular event and then using modern technologies on how to figure things out or to learn from it. So Gina Collada wrote the story of the 1918 flu pandemic, and talks about that, and it really, that unto itself is a microhistory, but then she uses modern technology and new medical information to discuss, to prompt a discussion on how we can prevent things like that from happening again, and what caused it, and all of these things that we've kind of learned from that moment in time. She also wrote one on Dolly, the sheep that was cloned, and then again using Dolly as a catalyst for how we can learn from that particular event. Beethoven's hair is an interesting one because it's actually two stories. It's the story of someone who had acquired over the years a vial of Beethoven's hair. So it's kind of the story of how that in and of itself occurred. But then it's a scientific story of the current DNA testing that we have. And they were able to find trace amounts of lead, and then it became sort of this backward story of how, since now we can see that there was all this lead in his DNA, then that could provide information on how he went deaf and how was he exposed to the lead. So I find those kind of an interesting way to backtrack, do some investigative. There's a lot of true crime nonfiction out there that use old crimes and use forensic evidence to solve crimes. And then, as I mentioned a little earlier, sometimes memoirs and biographies can serve as a microhistory. I was thinking of a few examples, and as I was thinking about talking about them, they didn't all quite fit. One that for me fits is a book by Roberta Price called Huerfano, and I'm still never sure if I'm saying that right either. But that's an area, it's a county in southern Colorado in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and it is a memoir of Roberta and her then boyfriend in the early 70s, who are Harvard graduates and come out west and live in a commune. And so it's their story of living in a commune, but for me it is also this, it encapsulates this moment in time and that experience in the counterculture movement. And for me personally, as someone who spent a lot of time in southern Colorado, I see it as a way to put myself in that place but in another time. Polaroids from the Dead is one of Douglas Copeland's few nonfiction pieces, and he's actually my favorite writer. But this is a series of kind of blurbs and vignettes on scenes from Grateful Dead concerts in the early 90s, ranging from the old hippies who had followed the Dead around since their inception in the late 60s to the newer deadheads of that time in the 90s, and just reflections. And so it's kind of a social memoir of this one sort of subculture that followed the Grateful Dead. And Stephen Ambrose, Nothing Like It in the World isn't really a memoir, but it made me think of how thinking about history through, again, the less famous people in our society. This is about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and there's so many biographies on the great men who essentially built the railroad, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. But this is about the actual men who built the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese immigrants, the freed slaves who came out west for work, and the actual workers that connected the East Coast and the West Coast. So those are just a few of the ones that I wanted to share, and I'll go back to that first link in a moment. But then talking about media, as we've connected some of our genres and our other programs, and how you can think about your collection and movies and TV and other forms of media beyond books, two websites, and certainly there are other TV channels that have great information, but PBS and the History Channel, both, I think a lot of the documentaries they show can be considered microhistories, but what's also nice about their websites is then they provide additional information for the person who just wants to get more information, or for teachers, they'll have lesson plans. A recent Ken Burns series, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, again, is a multi-part series about the development of the National Park Service, but then it's also it tells the story of America and how we changed the way we travel, a conversation on the politics of preservation and the environment. So that's one. But you can put in a lot of, and this series isn't on anymore, but they still keep information on that website. And I realize I've rambled on much longer than 15 or 20 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up here in just a moment. History Channel, again, a lot of their series are stories about one thing or event, and they have a lot of great educational resources. And this will be on the Get on the Bus website. It was just one of the better links I found that kind of aggregated a bunch of links to book lists. I'll let you know that a few of the links on this particular page are dead, but most of them aren't. So they'll connect you with some good book lists on titles that I maybe did not cover today. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up since I've kind of rambled on enough here. And I just want to invite, again, anyone, if there are any questions or comments about either my program or Richard's, if you didn't have an opportunity to ask a question after Richard's program. I'll give folks just a moment there. Again, you can raise your hand if you want to share your question with the group, or you can text one in your chat box, and I will read it. Okay, doesn't look like any questions have come through, and that's totally okay. Just a reminder that both presentations will be available at getonthebuswyoming.wordpress.com. There's the link for Richard's science fiction program and the link for my microhistories program. The webinars will be posted there later if you want to review them or let your coworkers know about them. And I guess that's all for today. So join us next Tuesday. And off the top of my head, I forget which ones are next Tuesday, but I will have it out in an email. But we have a few more programs next week and the following week. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.